Hello everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much Sebastian Georges, where is he? Ah, there, for your interesting talk with the very inspiring perspectives on landscapes. And I would like to add another perspective, the ecological perspective. And I want to relate it to diversity. I want to relate the changes of landscapes, viticultural landscapes, on the biodiversity effects. And in turn, this will link to the next talk given by Adrien Rüsch. Okay, evolution of viticultural landscapes and its effects on biodiversity. I completely agree that the landscape is the showcase or the showroom, you said, for viticulture. But I think it is also vice versa. There's an interaction between landscape and biodiversity, the composition of plant and animal species and the landscape. Viticulture has shaped the landscape and biodiversity for centuries in many countries. The similar pictures you have showed. So there are some pictures from Italy, from Switzerland, from Portugal, and also from the Middle Rhine Valley in Germany. I will come back to it later. These pictures have in common that it's a special type of viticulture. This is the steep slope viticulture. And these landscapes changed in a different way than viticultural landscapes of flat or slightly sloping areas. And that's why I want to differentiate between these two viticultural landscapes. Here it's more slightly sloped viticultural landscapes. For example, this is a famous viticultural region in Germany, Rheinhessen. Also the Rheingau region in Germany, where my university is located. And also France and Italian viticultural, slightly sloped landscapes. As examples for slightly sloped viticultural regions in Europe. Okay, so I would like to differentiate these two types of landscapes, and I would like to ask, how did these landscapes change? This is the first thing. And I want to relate this to biodiversity. What does this mean for biodiversity and biodiversity change? And at the end, and this is very important for me, and I think for viticulture in general, which options do we have to link economical viable, it's very, very important, economical viable viticulture with biodiversity and ecosystem services. Ecosystem services means the service of nature for human well-being. That means pollination, for example, is an ecosystem services, which nature, species, ecological processes gives to human well-being. Pollination, soil and plant, or pest control, for example. Another example is water retention and water filtering, for example. And we ask, what can we do? What can viticulture do to promote, to enhance biodiversity, to mitigate the biodiversity crisis? And I promise you, there are options. There are many options, especially in viticulture. So I will summarize for that some findings, some results of 3 projects supporting biodiversity in viticulture. First is promoting ecosystem services in grapes, a European project with French, Italian, Romanian, Austrian partners and from Switzerland. And the next is the BioQuiz project, focusing of steep slope viticulture and enhancing biodiversity by modern terracing. And the third project is not only a research project, but a research and application project of, to applicate measures for enhancing biodiversity in all German viticultural regions. I carried out these projects with several colleagues. PhD students were and are involved in the projects, as well as postdocs, and so this is a collaborative projects, and the findings is a team. It's a team task, or it was a team task. Okay. We start with the viticultural landscapes in slightly sloping areas. And this is an example from the Rheingau region. It's the scenery I see from my window, out of my window in my office at Geisenheim University. And it's slightly sloping, flat terrain. So how changed this landscape? And this is representative for all slightly sloped landscapes, viticultural landscapes in Germany. Let's have an aerial look on these landscapes. The recent look, it's from 2002, but only slightly changed this landscape from then, because it's the same arrangement, but only the settlements grew a little bit. Okay, you can see a typical landscape, viticultural landscape, dominated by vines here, and you have the settlements, scattered settlements, and a few different structures, like, for example, allotment gardens. So I often ask people, older locals, do you know if this landscape changed a lot in the last 50, 60 years? And often wine growers, and they told me, I don't remember, I think this landscape has changed only a little bit. But this is a misperception. As you can see here, we go back 50 years ago. This is a completely different landscape. This is not an evolution of the landscape, but it's more a revolution. Yeah, you can see that we have much. That we have. That we have much more plots, but of course smaller plots. This is the most striking property, and also we have much more margins between the different plots. And this is very important. I will come back later to it. And the other point is, when you have eagle eyes, you can see it. Here there are dark dots overall. And these are single trees, solitary trees, little alleys, little woodlands. And this is quite striking. I get back again. We have lost all the trees in the landscape. And we lost all the margins, the number of margins in the landscape. And a master's student has analyzed and quantified these changes, and a very nice method for this is to configure the landscape structures by landscape indices. And there you can see there's plot density. This is the number of plots. For such a circle, she analyzed this for a number of circles of 20 hectares. And you see here the average plot density from almost 200 to 30. And also the mean plot size changed a lot from 0.1 to 0.6 in average. That means, of course, the plots were larger. And this is very important, the edge density. This is the sum of the length of the margins. And you can see that it dropped from 20 or 24, about 24, to 8 kilometers per 20 hectare. So it's a complete change of this landscape. And also the distribution of solitary trees changed here from the number of trees from 600 in average in a 20 hectare circle dropped to about 200. So this is quite a very enormous difference before the land consolidation activities and after land consolidation activities to intensify agriculture. So why do I emphasize the edge density? It is very important for biodiversity. And we can sum up, we can state that there's a great homogenization of viticultural landscapes, a monotonization of this landscape. And this is representative for all the slightly sloped viticultural regions in Germany. Here's a different region, it is Franken, more in the middle south of Germany. And here a picture, a recent picture, aerial view of this area. And we go back to, I think, 60 years, 70 years ago. And you can assume how it looks like. It's the same evolution or revolution we had after in the 60s where land consolidation was taking place. Okay, why I have emphasized these margins? Because they have a very, very important significance for biodiversity. What has been lost when we don't have these margins between plots? That means these margins are small pieces where we have not such an intensive disturbance, where we have a non-crop area. And these are small areas for flower strips, for example, for hedgerows, for also wet habitats like ditches, for example, or very dry habitats like the stone piles or rock fragment lines. And these are structuring elements in a very heterogeneous landscape. And these are habitats with strong ecological gradients, from very dry to very wet, for example, or from completely undisturbed to a little bit or more disturbed. And this made very heterogeneous landscapes and give numerous habitats for different species communities and different species, of course, as you can see here. So these are habitats of dry habitats, such as reptiles, for example, some butterflies, for example. And the complete difference is the wet habitats with, of course, a community adapted to these wet habitats. And altogether, this made high and specific biodiversity in a landscape. So a heterogeneous landscape has a place for very different species communities, and this is the point why we have a higher diversity in heterogeneous than in monotonous landscapes. Okay, what does this mean for biodiversity? Of course, you know the point of biodiversity crisis, and I would like to give only two examples for this. A very interesting paper and important for Germany was a paper of Halmert et al., and he stated more than 75% decline over almost 30 years in total flying insect biomass in protected areas. That means protected areas, the best what we still have. And there we have a strong, enormous decline of insect biomass. You know that insect decline is an important point in nature conservation. And this paper, there were numerous papers before, stated the insect decline in our landscape, in the agricultural landscape especially, but only this paper have moved in the public. Yeah, it was very surprising. 3 weeks later, there were in the big newspapers the Time, the silence of the politicians, the major insect decline, and why the government does not get into action. And here, Rescue Me. Yeah, it's in the newspaper of 2020, and there were a lot of referenda initiatives from the public, and they gave pressure to the government, and they established then some action programs on insect protection, and there were some governmental actions after these public pressure. And going back to this paper, to this publication. Okay, another example for a species group where we see a large decline and a drop in species population, and these are the birds. We have substantial decline of birds, especially in the agricultural landscape. And this is especially true for the very common species like starling, tree sparrow, for example. And here you can see the decline in percent, and you see the starling, for example. We have within or during 30 years, we have a strong decline in the starling population, tree sparrow population, more than 50%, linnet 60%, and so on. And you have to be aware that in the 80s, there were a decline already, because the decline is related to the land consolidation activities. And in the 80s, there was a great awareness of ornithologists that there is a decline. And so this is not the zero line, the baseline where the world was okay, but there was a decline, and then from the 80s to 2010, there was a very, very important further decline of these birds in the agricultural landscapes. Okay, to summarize, the agricultural landscapes of the European Union has lost about the half of the birds in the last 30 years. And this is a loss altogether of 300 million birds in the agricultural landscapes of the EU. So you can see it is really an important task to mitigate this biodiversity crisis. And I could give numerous examples of in other species groups as well. So On the other hand, I would like to give an example or answer the question, does structural enrichment really bring back biodiversity in viticultural regions, in the vineyards? And we made a case study on wild bees in viticultural areas. This was a part of the PhD thesis of Denise Usman. And let's have a look on the results. We focused on bee species. You know, we have not only the honey species, but more than 550 bee species in Germany, and about half of them are threatened, especially these ones in the agricultural landscape. So, the experimental design, we worked in Rhine-Hesse. Here it's the Rhine River, here Geisenheim with the Rheingau region, and on the other side of the Rhine here is Rheinhessen. And we not only looked at the structural the significance of structural diversity in the landscapes, but also the management systems. That means organic vineyard, we differentiated or we compared organic vineyards and conventional vineyards in relation to bee communities and bee diversity. And therefore, we had 15 pairs of vineyards, one organic and one conventional. And these 15 pairs, we arranged along, we selected the vineyards along a gradient of structural richness, as you can see here. That means also landscape complexity. Having a gradient from low landscape complexity to high landscape complexity. And now let's have a look on the methods. We have the two vineyards in an area, and we looked in a radius of 1,000 meters the so-called semi-natural habitats. That means it's as a measure of landscape complexity. That means we looked for the cover of woodlands, meadows, fallows, for example, non-cropped area. And this is a measure for landscape complexity. So the methods, we used the trap nest approach with such nesting aids in the vineyards, in both vineyards of a pair and along altogether 15 pairs. And we have 2 trap nests per side, and we inserted them in the vineyards in the vegetation period in 2016. So after this time, we selected the tubes which were occupied, and you can see here already that there must be different species which have their nests in this tube, because they have different caps on the nesting tubes. And we selected them for overwintering, and after hatching we can easily, or not easily, it's difficult to determine the species of the bees. But this has worked so that we get an idea of the bee communities within the vineyards along a gradient of landscape complexity, and also the bee composition and diversity among organic and conventional vineyards. Okay, let's see the results. We see no clear difference between management systems in relation to the species numbers. As you can see, there's a small trend to more species in organic management systems, but it's not much. But we see a very clear pattern of the number of bee species along the landscape complexity gradients, with much more bee species in the landscapes when we have a rich landscapes, which give a very good hint for the close relationships between bee species diversity and landscape complexity. And let's have a look on not only on the bee species richness, but also of the abundances. That means the number of individuals in the vineyards. And you can see here that we have here a pattern. We have more individuals in organic management systems, but also here the relationship is much closer in relation to the landscape complexity gradient, with much more bee species when we have richer landscapes. So a hint and evidence for the importance of structural diversity, of landscape complexity in viticultural landscapes. Okay, that means landscape structural diversity matters for bee diversity in vineyards, and that means that it is important to have not only viticultural or vineyards, but also a mosaic of different habitats, like woodlands, for example, or meadows for fallows, which are in the mosaic in the landscape. This is the first point, but also I want to emphasize the corridors. Monsieur Georges has mentioned it as well. That means that these corridors are connections between spatial areas with core areas with which have a high value for species, and they link them together. This can be, for example, dry stone walls. This can rock fragment lines, for example, or flower strips. Hedgerows, we have a talk on hedgerows, I think. You have the talk about hedgerows, yes. And I will come to it in a minute. The revegetated embankments of modern terraced vineyards. So we need longitudinal structures. And what can we do within the vineyard or around the vineyards? There's a high potential for bringing biodiversity in the vineyards. Here you see a cleared viticultural landscape. And let's insert, or we have a potential to inserting punctual structures only when we, when we remove some vines and the margins where we have short rows, which have only a few vines. When we remove them, we have a great area for biodiversity, which has served as well as ecosystem service because they are much more, this is much more appealing vineyard or viticultural landscape, as the people told me. And of course, this is an cultural ecosystem service as well. So we can insert in some places, not in all, of course, because it we have to avoid that this is an obstacle, for example. Solitary trees. It can be very important dead wood, because this is a habitat for numerous insect species, for example. We can insert very easily perches for birds, for example, or nesting aid for above ground nesting bee species. But on the other hand, we have 2/3 of the bee species which have their nests below ground. And there are the so-called Sandarian, for example, to aid these bee species. And there are the stone points or stone piles I've mentioned before, and the flower strips, for example. And we had a great potential in the interrows here. And there's a possibility to heterogenize the vineyard in interrows where we have a certain diversity by seeding, for example, regional seed mixtures, and have their flowering and species-rich habitat, and the working interrows where the machineries go on and where the work is done. Yeah, this is a very cleared vineyard without very much diversity, also soil diversity, and it can be different. And in many cases, this works that there are no restrictions to at least to enrich biodiversity in some of these interrows. So this was, what I said, was for slightly sloping viticultural areas. You have learned that the intensification and going along with the land consolidation is the major problem. And of course, we don't want to get back without mechanization, but we want to have an efficient viticulture in combination with biodiversity. And a little bit different thing is in steep slope viticulture. Here a picture from the Middle Elbe. Whoops. From the Middle Elbe region, and you can see it's probably from 1929. You can see the typical steep slope vineyards where very small plots without any possibility for mechanization, of course. And they are surrounded by dry stone walls. What has been changed in these landscape? On the one hand, we have also an intensification of the vineyards, and they were replaced, the terrace vineyards were replaced by downhill-oriented vineyards. Where you can see here. Here's the Castle Ehrenfels, which you can see here. Yeah, and we have the look down to this castle. And here in the eastern part, you have the intensification and the replacement of terraced vineyards to downhill-oriented vineyards. And on the other hand, where it was not profitable to intensify these vineyards, you have a great abandonment of these areas. And this is much more the problem in these areas, at least in Germany, than the intensification. Why? You can see here the intensification was with the great land consolidations of the 60s. And a lot of vineyards were oriented then in downhill in the landscape. And you can see here that this is not profitable anymore, where you can see here the changes in area under vines in steep slope viticulture from the 80s on. 80s, there we had downhill-oriented landscapes, downhill-oriented vineyards, and these area under vine dropped. It is not profitable anymore because we have a certain mechanization, but of course it is very work intensive to work in the slopes. And this is true for the Mosel River as well as the Middle Rhine River or the Ahr River, for example. So we can state nowadays it's often unprofitable due to increasing labor costs on the one hand, and it can be an alternative to get back to terrace vineyards, but of course not with dry stone walls because it's very expensive. But it can be a modern terracing with embankments instead of stone walls. You have a simplified management due to even rows parallel to the slope, and this is economically viable, as colleagues from the economic department have analyzed. So, and you can imagine that these embankments have a great potential for biodiversity enhancement as well. We measured different species groups and can state that we have a much greater biodiversity of flora and associated fauna in these terraced vineyards in comparison, to 2 minutes, I think, in comparison to the four-line vineyards. This is the one point. And we can state that we have, of course, a great ecological connectivity. This is the second. And we can state great erosion control in comparison, of course, you can imagine, of the four-line vineyards. And we have some not significant results about the vine health. This is not very, it's very similar to four-line and terraced vineyards. Yeah, the only thing you must have as a wine grower, you must have patience for 1 year. In the first year, the embankments of seedings which are seeds were open, more or less, but nevertheless there is a much stronger erosion control in relation or in comparison to four-line vineyards which were newly established. So this is, you must compare this, and this is much more protected for erosion. And after 1 year, you have a densely vegetated embankments. When it is done with regional seeding mixture, it's much better than commercial ones because they are more adapted to the environment and to the regions. Okay, what can we do to enhance biodiversity? I want to sum up. Yeah? First, it's promising it is possible to combine agricultural land use and habitat conservation, especially in viticulture. And in viticulture and slightly sloped terrains, we have to interrupt landscapes homogenization by establishing spatial distributed areas, a diversity of landscape structures such as fallows, woodlands, meadows, for example. And we have to insert or establish landscape corridors, which are important to connect different landscapes elements. And we need diverse structures within and around vineyards, such as species-rich inter-row vegetation, perches, solitary trees and shrubs, nesting habitats, and so on. And in steep slope viticulture, we need to maintain the open or at least semi-open character of this traditional viticultural landscapes by land use. Yeah? and by the maintaining vineyards, but also orchards, for example, mown or grazed grasslands, that play a role, and an alternative to fall-line, the unprofitable fall-line viticulture. It can be the terracing of steep slope vineyards. Okay, thanks go to my colleagues and so on, and of course for your attention. Thank you.